do things as an individual in terms of riding your bike instead of taking your car and things like that. But ultimately, because we live in a large, complex society, we need to act in ways that require government, and that means we need to get our government leaders to act. And so one of the things that we've been working on is getting President Obama to move forward with regulations that he proposed before the last election, which would actually require limits on carbon pollution from new fossil fuel plants. Basically, if you build a new fossil fuel plant, you're going to have to find a way to capture or reduce those carbon emissions. So that's something that we're pushing hard for. And that petition that many of you signed when you came in the door was all about that. And if you didn't sign the petition, we hope you would. But obviously, that's just one aspect of this. And as we were involved in this campaign, I've shared with some of my other colleagues the campaign is, as long as we're just asking people for these tangible, specific things, I think in some way we lose the motivation, because it's like, oh, it's simply a matter of getting Cheating McCarthy ratified as the new director for the EPA, or it's getting these regulations promulgated by the president. But in all honesty, we know the problem is much bigger than that, and while we have to take small steps, we really need to be pushing for a real sea change, a real gestalt in the way we look at these problems and the way we deal with it. And hearing from our speakers tonight, I mean, there was definitely a clear statement that we have to act, we have to be teachers, we have to accept a moral responsibility here to serve not just ourselves and our neighbors, but our world. And so with that, I'd like to get your comments, your questions. The acoustics in here seem to be pretty good, so if people have a hard time hearing the question, I'll be happy to repeat it. But let's go ahead.
First, thank you all for your great comments. I appreciate it and all. But I just have a question. Can you really compare the U.S. to China when they have 4 times as many people as us? The American average carbon footprint is 20 tons, and China's average carbon footprint is 5 tons. If we were really going to compare ourselves to China, shouldn't the U.S. have a carbon footprint as a whole of about 1/4 of what China has? I mean, wouldn't that be an equal comparison?
We do have a mic now. Hey, let me address that question and get other panels, because I think that's a really interesting one. George Monbiot is a Brit who's a thinker on these issues, and basically said, suppose you actually ran the numbers, you determined how much carbon we think that the world can absorb, and then we divided it by other people in the world, and then basically you had your bank account, you had your carbon bank account, okay? Obviously, because we're using so much more, we would be overdrawn in a second. We'd have those credit cards that we couldn't pay off. And we'd really be owing people in Africa and other countries where and so it really raises some fundamental questions with regard to ethics, with regard to equity, with regard to how to implement policies. But I think your point's well taken. I mean, bottom line is, and these are just some rough numbers, the United States has about 5% of the world population, 25% of the pollution. Okay, the Chinese probably have about 25% of the population, roughly the same amount of pollution does, so that's 25%. So basically, they're pretty much doing their share to pollute the world, at least in an equitable fashion, whereas we are 5 times over budget. So that is a real interesting question that's out there, and how we deal with it in terms of policies is another question. How we deal with it in ethics is as well. Would others like to comment on that?
I will just say the article that's on the table from today's Richmond Times kind of addresses this a little bit, and I think it is important to recognize that what we do in the United States we can't enforce in other countries. That's why it's so great that we have this UN Intergovernmental Panel on climate change, and we have the Conference of the Parties annually meeting to try to figure out and encourage a global solution to the problem. But I think one thing to think about when you start to look at it on a global picture is if we all sit back and say, I'm just an individual citizen and I can't do much to the global picture, or I'm going to sit back and wait till someone else takes initiative on this, then nothing will effectively get done. And so that's where it's important to recognize that every small bit helps. And one thing that I think is really important in the work that we do is combining that individual citizen action with the legislative action. Sometimes it's really hard to convince the General Assembly of Virginia or even Dominion Virginia Power that we need to embrace renewable energy within the Commonwealth. But if a bunch of you decided that you wanted to put solar panels on your roof or called up Dominion and said, I'm willing to spend a little extra on my bill every month to purchase green power, then you're making a statement to our legislators and to our major utility company that this is something you want to see us invest in. And it makes it easier for the work that we do in advocacy to go to those people and say, the community demands this. Your citizenry demands this. And so if we can take those small individual or community actions and lump them together, then we can make a difference, whether it's here in the United States or even globally. It's a lot easier for the president and our representatives to the UN to say, hey, China, hey, India, the three of us are at the top of carbon in the world. We're doing something on it finally. So let's work with you. And I think Glenn mentioned earlier, sharing technologies, being able to share that technology with them, I think is a way to help in that conversation.
One of the challenges we have as we work individually, we're all these little atoms spinning around. Almost every spiritual tradition has a care for the earth upon which we live, ethic and moral. So if it's there, why are we not combining our individual faith communities into a larger coalition, consortium of that? So that when we make a statement, it's not one congregation or one movement. It's tens of thousands of members of different communities across the board from the whole diversity of American spiritual traditions. When that happens, things change. But we have to be willing to work together through organizations like yours. But to make the statement from a faith side, there's more agreement than disagreement. There's a lot more biconceptual folks out there who actually do want to care about the earth, no matter where they are politically. But if we have to get our own communities to do that, not to say, well, I do it in my little social action group. No, my religious community has made a statement as a religious community. It's leadership, and we're now binding with the Methodists, with the Catholics, with the Presbyterians, the Unitarians. And together, we're making these statements in the expectation that your company, in your state, operates within the ethical moral. You come to church, you come to synagogue, we hold you accountable. You don't get to talk about your faith if you're not walking that talk.
Issue. I don't think that there are many people who are really going to be moved by the fact that Mauna Loa is now registering 400 parts per million. I think moral example is going to make the difference. We are, after all, primates, and we like to imitate each other. Addressing one of the earlier questions, however, the book, The Carbon Tax, has some good answers to that question. And if you haven't read The Carbon Tax, take a look at it. It's a fairly nice analysis. For those of us in Richmond, I also want to mention a group called Transitions Richmond, which instead of taking the approach of, let's say, in-your-face antagonism, is simply trying to live the revised way of life. Let's put it that way. The way of life that says that we can want what we have, and we can have less. They are doing this by emphasizing resilience, sustainability, culture, and of course low footprints. And if you are not familiar with the Transitions group, simply go to transitions.com, look for Transitions Richmond. There are frequent meetings. There is a site at Cool Spring, not too far from the showplace, where some of the methodology of permaculture and other ideas are currently being modeled.
Thank you. You know, this issue of moral example that was just referenced here in the idea of moral teaching, I wanted to share something that really came to me as a surprise. I mean, I think a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that, you know, Americans live large in the world, both in terms of our military policies, and also in terms of, I think, the respect that we also have in terms of people who want to come here and share our freedoms, and also fear our military. But one of the things I learned in going to a number of these international conferences is that even though there's other people out there, other countries out there that are doing good things, Europe's done a lot, okay, or would like to do good things, if the United States, this is kind of, it sounds arrogant to say this, but I learned this by going to these international conferences. If the United States does not lead, then there seems to be a real vacuum with regard to leadership in the world. And I don't know why that is, but it just seems to be a fact. And we may resent that obligation, we may embrace that obligation, but the point is that we are looked to, for whatever reasons, as a leader in the world. And if we fail to act on the issue of climate change, then the negotiations don't go anywhere in the UN. And that's a burden, it's an opportunity. And I'd like to look at it as an opportunity for this president to lead, and he needs a lot of encouragement. So when it comes to teaching, we need to teach the president to act. So I'm going to go back to that. I mean, obviously we've got our problems with Congress, we've got our problems at local government levels. We can do a lot with having, you know, these schools renovated to be energy efficient here, and you know, not just shutting them down. But in all honesty, looking at this from the international level and obligations, one of the things I've learned is that the United States is a world leader, for good or for bad. And in the case of, and if we're just absent from the stage, like we've been on climate change, then it's hard to make progress on a worldwide problem. And so I think that's why it's so important that this president take action. Anyone like to comment on that, or any other questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Presentation, and I err on the side of the American, Native American way, of all things done in a good way, looking at the 7 generations. I'm a grandmother, I'm an organic home grower. I've been involved in food issues for many decades. But when Fukushima happened, it threw me looking at the energy issue. And then, of course, we had our earthquake here. From that point, it became very clear to me that the carbon issue is very important, but what we're going to see is we're going to see a push saying that nuclear is carbon-free, and that is not true. Its carbon footprint is very large, because you have to include the mining, of course we've been working on the Keep Down Rate Mine in Virginia, the milling, the processing, and of course from that one mine alone, they want to leave us with 28 million tons of radioactive rubble that many future generations would have to deal with. So as our leader, Obama, obviously the president, our senators and congressmen, here recently I know Warner and Kane have both mentioned they'd like to lift the ban on offshore drilling. We need to push for solar, wind, geothermal, tidal. These technologies exist, and that's the direction we need to go in. Because really, at North Anna, we have Dominion wanting to put a 3rd reactor at North Anna, and it's built on a fault line. It's a bad idea, and we don't need a Fukushima here. And so I'm hoping that more and more people realize the push for true renewables. And that's what Dominion needs to hear from us, as well as our representatives, as well as the president, that we want true renewable energy that's safe, because really with the people in Fukushima and the area you're dealing with, we're not seeing that here. I have friends that have family there, and it's out of control, and they don't even know what to do. We've never experienced a 3 meltdown right by the coast, and we can't contain it. So I think we really need to make sure we don't fall into that lie that nuclear energy is clean, or that it's safe, or that it's carbon-free, because it's also the same industry that produces plutonium for weapons and bombs. Thank you.
There's an injustice here that we fail to measure, I believe, which is that as long as we continue to argue over the diversity of viewpoints, or as Ben said, people think they get to endlessly argue against the obvious facts. There's something that we are robbing from our next generations particularly, but of ourselves. When we do not focus on the need to lighten our footprint, and when we take our eye off of that, or remove our concentrated effort from the scientific challenges that are necessary to develop alternate and more efficient ways of engaging our use of power, when we fail to do solar, tidal, geothermal, we actually are robbing the next generation of the things that will make them prosperous. Perhaps not in profit, but actually in moral wealth, in personal happiness. We are actually keeping them from the work that is theirs to do. So as a generation of Americans, especially a generation in power right now, we are failing morally to create the opportunities that are necessary and the jobs and the livelihoods that follow. And we so seldom measure this. It often surprises me that the 20-year-olds are not out on the street screaming at the injustice that's being visited on them by our dithering and disinterest.
I also want to add about the conversation about energy sources and our call to the moral imperative is recognizing that when we rely on fossil fuels because we're being told that it is a cheap energy cost, and we see that in our energy bills, we're not really realizing the true cost of those energy sources. I talked a little bit about disproportionate impacts on low-income families that live around coal-fired power plants. But there's a lot of health-related costs that are part of the whole process of mining, milling, the extraction processes that we use, the way that it impacts with fracking, the way that it impacts water quality usage. And right now, all of those costs are externalized. And so, Dominion tells you that they're going to rely on coal, nuclear, and gas because it's low cost, and you're going to be happy with that because your utility bill is low. But when you have young children that are experiencing asthma attacks as a coal train runs through Richmond, or you have pollution coming off of local plants, and parents are having to miss days of work in order to take care of their asthmatic children, those costs are not rolled into what you're paying to the utility company. But when we start to internalize those costs and recognize the true economic impact of our choice to rely on fossil fuels, then it becomes a bigger driver for us to say it's time to make the transition to those more renewable fuel sources. And that's why if you can invest a little bit in the Green Power Purchase Program from Dominion, or do what you can to say that we need to shift off of these and recognizing those other costs that aren't part of your utility bill. I think that helps raise the issue as well.
We're going to go to the questions back first, then we'll come up here.
I was going to talk about you can't talk about your faith unless you're walking it, and about like personal responsibility y'all been mentioning.
Keep the microphone very close to your mouth.
I could be so presumptuous as to offer some encouragement. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and been there for a couple of years. And I had to go back recently to take care of my mother. She was ill. But I had a lot of time on my hands, so I made a vegetable garden in the backyard, and I followed the community garden. And my brother's actually doing the same thing with his life, and talking about like different perspectives. Like, I'm a spiritual person, and he absolutely is not. And one thing he's discovered is it just saves him money, you know? And the whole pay it forward aspect, like the whole pay it forward is not just something you can tell your grandkids so they can sleep good at night. It's actually like a phenomenon in the world. He goes to his industrial plant job, where he actually gets all the wooden crates he uses for his raised beds, and just shows pictures to good old boys in the rural area in Greensboro and Winston-Salem about all the vegetables he's growing, and more than almost a dozen of them now have little, like, they're just developed plots or 5-gallon buckets, and they're starting to grow veggies just because, one, it's cheaper. Everybody likes, at least in North Carolina, I'm sure in Virginia, a bunch of tomato sandwiches in the summer. And once they start growing their own thing and seeing, like, hey, I'm turning dirt into stuff I can eat, it's turning into me, that connection to the earth will just be innate. It's not, you don't have to get mystical with it, it's just a physical fact, and humans being what they are, you'll feel some sort of transcendent affection for that fact, look, I'm connected. This is, that's interesting. But another thing about, like, taking responsibility for yourself, I think before you can get political with it, like, for me, I'm very serious about I'm very expansionist when it comes to growing your own vegetables in community gardens and urban farms. I think that, like, if we're going to try and become more organic as a society, we have to model organic processes. And a tree grows from the roots up. So you really have to make the situation immediately around you, your house, as sustainable as you practically can. And I say practically, like, you have to do it, basics. Grow some of your own vegetables and really see what you can make your immediate situation better. And then when you go out to talk to somebody about how it's important that they do it too, when they're like, well, I don't even know where to freaking start. Well, here you go, And it's just, I don't know, I've just had a lot of time just recently just to develop my own sustainability in my own house, and it's very easy. And another thing I'll say, and this is the last thing, there's this woman named Rosalind Creasy, who lives in Northern California, and she did I think in 2008, 2009, she did a study, 100 square foot garden study, like how much yield you could get in a seasonal garden, and she saved personally something like $700, got about 250 pounds of produce in one growing season. And the $700 is just the money that she would take out of her wallet at the grocery store. She didn't include gas prices or anything like that. And she extended it to include 42 million homes in the United States, which is half of the homes that reported to, like, some American Gardening Association. 42 million is half of the homes that reported gardening in 2008. So half of the gardening homes in 2008 did half as good as she did. $15 billion went back in the pockets of those 42 million homes. So if you come back to, like, they actually do, a good job of 100 square feet, and all the gardening homes do it. It's only 8-hour startup about for a 100 square foot garden. It would be like over $60 billion. So, like, you can go spiritual with it, you can go practical with it. When something makes sense and it's a good idea, it's just a good idea, period.
The way we produce our food today. And in fact, the soil, our natural soil, if we were to use organic methods, for example, is a major carbon sink that we're losing as a practical matter. And if we were able to change our agricultural practices, a lot of the carbon we're concerned about could be captured in the soil, a healthy soil. So it's just something that comes up. And in fact, in the United Nations, part of the discussions center around agricultural practices because they're such a large source of CO2. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Bob Faithful, and I'm with the Episcopal Virginia Diocese Stewardship for Creation Committee. But I also am from West Virginia. I grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia. My grandfather was a coal miner. And I also spent 33 years with the Interior Department, with the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, was the Director of Environmental Justice for the department, but then spent the last third working with small businesses. So I've got three things I want to share. First of all, one of the reports that just came out, and unfortunately I'm low tech, hit print, and I only meant to print the executive summary, but I printed 132 pages, was the International Energy Agency just released a report on Monday called Redrawing the Energy Climate Map. It's got some very good and very very strong ideas in terms of focusing particularly upon the energy sector and ways that we can limit climate change. I'm not going to go through all those because I think it's 3 things. But it is online. There have been a series of articles published in both many of the newspapers. If you just put in International Energy Agency, and you'll see the report this week that comes up on it. The second thing is that a long time ago, I was very impressed by a well-paid consultant who was a futurist. And he came in and we paid him a lot of dollars. And what he did is he put newspaper pictures up on the screen. He said, if you read the newspaper, you can figure out what the future is. Well, just in the last 2 months, I've been pulling articles from different organizations. The Wall Street Journal on May 4th says autism linked to environmental factors. That's not the New York Times, that's the Wall Street Journal. We've got the New York Times talking about the cost of environmental damage in China growing rapidly among industrialization. Also an article on Egypt's birth rate raises as population control vanishes. Pollution's role in heart risks, and the ever-popular USA Today took a front page article on May 3rd through June 2nd, pollen plague, how climate change is affecting every breath you take. So if we want to go beyond whether it's a Republican or Democratic issue, or whether it's an us versus them issue, then all we have to do is look at what are the trends that are taking place, that are common things that we can talk about involving our children's health, our community's health. I wanted to go back, I guess, to what I think was a very good point that was made. It was about how the civil rights movement led because of moral imperatives. And now we have this movement. And I want to go to my friend in West Virginia because I mentioned that my grandfather was a coal miner, but he also had black lung disease. The people that are impacted often by working in many of the energy-related areas do have to have the community health, the community outreach, and the moral support of the churches to find ways to step up and not just find a way of losing their job or being fired, but finding an alternative way to take that on. The other thing that struck me was that oftentimes, I don't come to Richmond that often. I live up in Northern Virginia in Centerville. I was visiting my son and driving around at night. I said, Dad, those are flood walls. I said, really? How far? He said, yeah, that's a flood wall over there, and that's a flood wall over there. The last part of my career was spent on what they call COOP, looking at ways to prepare for disasters and how to put together plans. One of the things that the civil rights movement did with the ministers was to have sessions that energized people around what they could do to make their home areas safe. How, in fact, the communities could come together and look at where the vulnerabilities were. If a flood takes place, who's going to get hit? Do we have alternative ways of getting water or food to people if the water supply is infected or damaged? That's one of the challenges on a very practical basis that I think the churches can take on and take a look at. Now, I know that sometimes we see the government as the enemy, but in fact, the EPA, through their Environmental Justice Program, has had for decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations grant programs for communities and churches and colleges to work together. We're here in a college town. Most of us are close to colleges somewhere, whether it's a community college. If you have a church combined with that, and you have a community that wants to make a change, you can go for a variety of grants that are available through that program. Then finally, we also have a situation where, again, with looking at FEMA and all the type of activities, I don't think the president is unaware of climate change. I mean, he toured Sandy, he's been to New Jersey. In fact, one of the national strategic issues that came up was climate change and the Arab Spring. You addressed Thomas Friedman's articles. He's written 2 great articles from Yemen over the last month, where he went to Yemen and talked about the deforestation of Yemen and how the water that used to be sucked in by trees runs down to the nice paved highway that runs right into the middle of town and is lost. So there is an opportunity for us to take a look at what are some of the practical aspects that we as a community, which involves business, which involves government, which involves colleges, can take in terms of practical steps to make ourselves well. And like I said, I tossed a lot of stuff out there, but I'm really looking at what are your suggestions for practical things that if you were a civil rights organizer, you should be doing now to get on the climate change issue.
Let me offer one thing. This came up as a suggestion, and that's a good question for our panelists. How many folks in here are actually fathers? Have children? Okay, great. Well, Father's Day is coming up, and we know that President Obama is a father, has 2 lovely daughters. And one suggestion was that you send him a note. You can go on the White House comment line and say, as a father, I know you share the concerns I have as a father, and we really need to do something for our children about climate change. So there's a practical thing that you can do to affect the president's outlook, and I think that's one way to touch him, because he does understand this issue, but we need to move him forward. So you can also, as a father, write a letter to the editor too. So there's a couple of suggestions that we have out there right now that I hope that you might take. Just if you Google White House comment line, it's there, and all you gotta do is enter your name and address and send a note to the president about your perspective as a father on Father's Day and your desire to protect your children and his children for the future.
And I will also say that if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor, I have some templates from a faith-based perspective around Father's Day and the need for President Obama as a father to act around this issue. So if you're interested in that, talk to me afterwards and I can get you that template.
Other comments from our panelists? What can you do? Okay. All right, let's get some
kindred organization. And we were just Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonprofit. We have a sign, but we're not here to promote that. Sign just fell out of my pocket. But we were despondent over this issue a year and a half ago, because as parents, as people that care about the world and other people, we looked out, and it looked very, very bad. And what helped us address that sense of despondency and despair over what was happening to the world and what kind of world it would be for our children and grandchildren was getting active, getting involved, and working as hard as we could to see effects of change. And that for us has been a very healing and positive effort. It's taken a lot of work. So what Judy?
Well, maybe just quickly what the activity maybe is.
Well, sure. We're with Citizens Climate Lobby, and but from my memory of the Civil Rights Movement, this is a big house, and it takes everybody. If you don't have people that march and carry signs and chain themselves to fences, and as Molly Ivins said, go out the street and bang pots together, they're not going to listen to Washington. You have to have people that will talk to them about policy and help the legislators see the light and find a way to adopt sensible policies. You have to have people of faith that show them the moral imperatives, and you have to have a whole host of citizens that do the right thing every day in their personal life and are terrific examples and make people aware of that. So it takes everybody to do this, and that's what I do know. We have a letter writing campaign, and after this we can talk to you about it, but we do that too. We help people write letters. We are going to Washington to lobby congressmen next 2 weeks from now. We're going to see every member of Congress from our area of Virginia. But I think the question I actually have is, how can we work together as members of the faith, starting with this panel and what you said and what we're doing? How can we start to put this together in a way that will get us more mobilized, organized, and coordinated, so we can be effective in expressing our belief in changing policy?
Good question. I think that maybe coming out of this, if you sign that petition, we've got your name and your phone number and email address, and we can certainly invite folks to come in in terms of building a climate coalition in Virginia to take action as a group of people, not just one organization, but many. So I think that's one thing that we can do. I've been looking at that, talking to some of my colleagues about how we do that, and just started keeping this conversation going. I just say this, people go to church, I think, because of the sense of community that's there, and obviously the commitment to shared values. And I think that this gathering tonight, in some ways, people of many faiths, but a shared value in terms of commitment to the earth is here. And so I think we need to build on that, just like the church builds on its own community with regard to the particular priorities it has. In some sense, we have a community here of people who are concerned about climate change and looking for ways to act, and they can be as simple, depending on how green your thumb is gardening, as was suggested, and becoming self-sufficient or more sufficient in your food, as well as taking action to move the commerce. So lots of things that we can do, and we'll keep this communication going here. I think I said this program would go to about 8:30, as I recall, and so I don't really want to belabor too long, but are there any other questions or comments?
I'm actually going to, sorry, Rabbi, did you want to speak as well?
Couple things. One is, this cuts across all sides. President Bush, not my favorite president probably, had one of the most energy efficient, least footprintable homes in Crawford. It was an amazing thing. And didn't get translated into legislation, but realized that people do things that make sense even if they don't say that thing that makes sense. So there's something to work with. The challenge we have is we keep speaking as individuals. And even our individual movements speak as individual movements. The reason the civil rights movement worked, the reason that gay and lesbian movement and the idea of if you want to marry somebody, you get to marry the person you want to marry, has changed so dramatically is that communities have joined together to talk about the moral imperatives, the rights and the standards and the beliefs. And so when we join together and we don't say, well, Rabbi Romer says this. No, Congregation of Orme says that. And there are 600 members in that community. People, men, women, children, babies, and old people. And the church next door is in it. And there are 1,000 people in that. And all of a sudden you have 10,000, you have 20,000, you have 50,000, you have 100,000 people who say, our leaders in each of our individual communities say, this is a value we have. It's our God values, it's our spiritual values, and we have now joined hands and arms with others as well. That gets attention. That is why the civil rights movement succeeded. It was a moral imperative, but it wasn't individuals alone. It was groups. It was each faith community saying, this is a faith commitment. This is our land. The sky is ours, not private corporations. The land is ours. It belongs to the people. And we have an obligation to assure that it's cared for. And those who want to use it pay for it, not us. And that involves those private corporations coming to the table at full cost for what they say. Only when we do that, we recognize it is ours and we are in this together, are we going to have the traction we need.
Yeah.
We're going to close this. Thank you. Ask each of our panelists. Thank you so much, Reverend.
I want to go back to the question that Bob asked, and I think that was sort of a follow-up of what can we do, and I'm going to shamelessly plug Interfaith Powered Light right now. So I would love for you to sign up for our Action Alert email list. I will admit I'm not the best at that, but I'm working on it. So our website is VIPL.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at VAIPL. So check us out and get information that way. Here in Richmond, we have a partnership with the Richmond Region Energy Alliance to offer homeowners resources for energy efficiency in your homes. We're also working on programs for communities of faith to embrace energy efficiency. And there's also a really great new opportunity coming to Richmond around food, and that's the Richmond Food Co-op. And I'd love to get you information about any of these resources. I should have enough cards for everybody here if you want to take a card and be in touch. But in closing, I will just say again, I'm really grateful for you joining us tonight and beginning this conversation. And I would encourage you to continue the conversation, whether with us as a community or within your own communities, whether it's a faith tradition community or your neighborhood community, to keep talking about this issue and encouraging change in social action. Thank you.
As we close out this evening.
Well, I do want to thank you all again for letting us act in our own mission, which is to serve the community and to work for justice in this world. So it doesn't make sense if we have facilities and they're not being used for that purpose. Human beings are very good at making sure the baby gets fed and the fire gets put out, and the things that urge us to move swiftly towards a very specific and measurable thing so we can say the work is done. We are not so good at complex, long-term, deferred outcome problems that in fact are not at our doorstep, not nipping at our heels, not whatever metaphor you care to use to cite energy and urgency. But that means that because you feel the urgency, what we have to do is to convey the urgency one person at a time. Now, for some of us, that's the state legislator who we've got to work with very carefully to convert them in the religious sense. For some of us, that's a whole congregation of people that we need to be working with in the hopes that 10,000 little decisions turn into something worth doing. But above all, for activists, I think, I just want to offer the gentle reminder and the blessing that though it may feel sometimes like your work is endless and futile and frustrating, that is what the people out on the edge always feel. And there is justice being served by your actions. If some of us don't know as much as you know or are not as convinced as you are, don't give up. Stay with what you believe and gently and compassionately continue to share it. Because little by little it is having an effect, perhaps not so measurable in your own lifetime as in the generations to come. My religious tradition teaches me that this is sacred work you are doing, and I don't care if you're an agnostic or an atheist, it's still sacred work in the realm of human purpose. Stay with it. Recommit to it. Nourish yourself as people so that you can endure and persevere. And then let's all come back tomorrow and do it again.